Just less than 2.5 million years ago, in the early Pleistocene epoch of Eastern Africa, a group of hairy bipedal apes evolved, and soon after began to use basic stone tools. They didn't know it, but they were the first species of a new genus that would one day transform the world beyond recognition. This was Homo habilis, the very first species of true human under the genus name Homo, the full binomial name translating to handyman. For almost 1 million years, these apes would live in social colonies across the plains and savannas of eastern and southern Africa, and were our earliest human ancestors. Life wasn't easy for them, though. The plains of prehistoric Africa were wild, filled with danger, and life was often short and perilous. Homo habilis persisted, however, and a group of individuals would one day split from the species, stepping one pace closer on the path to you and me. Today, we will be taking a look at how these strange early apes lived, how they evolved, how they were built, where they lived, and ultimately how they died. Welcome to our documentary on Homo habilis, the very first species of human. If you were to take a Homo habilis individual 2.5 million years in the future to the present day, put him in a suit and have him walk down the street, he would turn a few heads. The same might not be said for some of the later human species, but Homo habilis was very clearly the first step on the human line, and was very much an early prototype to the path that would one day lead to Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo denisova, the 3 species of human that made up the late Pleistocene Ice Age. No, Homo habilis lived much earlier, and their kind was still endemic to Africa's plains and savannas. An adult male Homo habilis may have grown up to around 5 feet tall, smaller than the average height of the modern day. They were most likely very hairy, as the genus of ape that predated them, Australopithecus, were much more similar to that classic ape form than to what we think of as a modern human, and there were many shared facial characteristics between the two creatures. The arms of these early humans were still long and were still well adapted to climbing and swinging through trees to escape danger. These apes may have left the safety of the trees for the rewards of the bountiful grasslands, but they were still in danger from many different species of wild animal and needed to be cautious. Therefore, a quick escape back to the branches was often necessary. Homo habilis likely spent the vast majority of its time walking upright, and was even capable of breaking into a speedy run for much longer periods of time than its predecessors. It's likely that Homo habilis's legs, therefore, were much longer than any previous species of ape, and groups of these species likely traveled relatively long distances across the African savannas in search of food or new territories to claim. It is ultimately Homo habilis's face that would have set our individual apart from the crowd when walking down a modern street. He would have still possessed many primitive human features that were yet to develop to look like you and me. The cranial capacity of Homo habilis was less than half of that found in modern humans, resulting in a much narrower forehead, higher set eyes, and a smaller, more ape-like back of the skull. The nose was much flatter than a modern human's, and the nostrils were large and forward-facing. Homo habilis's mouth protruded forward more too, obviously betraying its ape ancestry. Altogether, this was a very different species of ape to the ones that had existed previously. But it wasn't an easy path to get to where they were at this point. As we're about to find out, Homo habilis' ancestors likely found life even more difficult. As we mentioned in the previous section, Homo habilis, the first species in the genus Homo, evolved from a genus of bipedal, upright walking ape named Australopithecus, or southern ape when translated to English. Australopithecus accentuated the ape-like features prominent in Homo habilis, most notably in the face again. It was likely hairier. Its mouth protruded even further. The brain case was smaller still, and it was highly adapted to life in the trees. Australopithecus was the first ape to walk upright for extended periods of time, and in evolving towards Homo habilis and its future kin, it would focus more and more on abandoning the trees, adapting entirely to life on the ground. The most likely candidates for the Australopithecus species that led to the Homo habilis include the famous Australopithecus afarensis, or the lesser-known Australopithecus sediba, which started to die out just under 3 million years ago, when one branch of one of these species would begin to lead to our Homo habilis. As scientists have found, it is extremely hard to pinpoint exactly when the Australopithecus genus gave rise to the Homo one, and prior to Homo habilis' 1964 discovery by Louis Leakey, Philip Tobias, and John Napier, it was assumed that it was Homo erectus, a later species that was the next stop along. This seemed like a big jump, as erectus was a much more obvious change straight from the Australopithecus genuses. As such, it became obvious that another piece of the puzzle had then been completed. But what caused one of the Australopithecus species to evolve into Homo habilis? This is a question that has been the subject of debate over the years since Homo habilis' discovery. But it may have something to do with food sources, or the environments in which the apes lived. Perhaps the trees, which Australopithecus and its ancestors relied on, became more sparse, causing them to descend from the trees and become more adapted to walking upright. Perhaps some species adapted to feed on different foods. Many species of early upright ape held omnivorous diets, adapted to eating plant matter and meat, which may have been more readily available on the ground. Although Homo habilis was officially announced and described as a new species in 1964, the first evidence for its existence was unearthed in the Oldowan Gorge, a significant paleoarchaeological site in Tanzania, when 2 fossilized teeth were unearthed in a region led by Mary and Louis Leakey from Britain. These teeth were from an adult ape, uncannily similar to a modern human being, and as time went on, the Oldowan Gorge would prove to be more and more fruitful as a location for unearthing fossils from this new species. The following year, a partial skeleton was discovered in the gorge, belonging to a young Homo habilis male. And from there, successful expeditions became commonplace. Today, we have a good understanding of Homo habilis' anatomy, which we have managed to discern from a number of different fossils. These include teeth, entire skulls, lower jaws, lower leg bones, bones from the foot, and several partially complete skeletons. The bones of Homo habilis tell us an awful lot about how these creatures may have lived, adapted, and interacted with their dynamic Pleistocene environment. The bones of the hand tell us that these apes would have been able to close a precision grip around an object, for example. This was due to developments in the brain, which allowed these creatures to develop the ability to produce basic stone tools, but we'll go into detail on that more later on in the video. It was the length of the legs and arms, when contrasted against one another, that tell us that, while this was a creature who could readily walk upright, it was still at home in the safety of the trees. This, combined with the shape of their jaw and skull, tell us that they were more closely related to Australopithecines than we first thought. The teeth, in particular, showed evidence of creatures that were well on their way to evolving into animals that resembled us. Their teeth were very much like ours, with the exception of the incisors. These were still relatively long and sharp, similar to those of a chimpanzee or gorilla. Most significant of all was the brain case of Homo habilis. As the brain expanded, so did the skull, and the 600 or so cubic centimeters of brain in these apes caused the skull to bulb out and become more rounded in the process. The brain made up a total of 1.7% of Homo habilis's body weight, a significant statistic when compared with the apes it evolved from. Homo habilis was a significant discovery. This was plainly a creature more advanced than the Australopithecine apes it succeeded, but was too primitive to be considered a member of the later species. Unsurprisingly, Homo habilis would go on to become a very controversial species, and some scientists debate its existence at all, claiming that it was synonymous with Homo rudolfensis, a creature with which it shared the open plains of Tanzania. Firstly, it is important to note that Homo habilis is believed to have been one of the first users of early stone tools in the Homo genus. Although the Australopithecines, the more primitive species we met earlier, were using the most basic of tools to crack open food items prior to the evolution of Homo habilis, our Homo ancestors took it to a new level entirely that would lay the foundations for the basics of future machinery and tool use. Homo habilis is most closely associated with the use of a stone tool industry known as the Oldowan, a prehistoric grouping of tools identified by their simple nature and sharp edges that were used to skin and butcher animals or to break into their tough carcasses. The Oldowan industry tools share various similar features. They are rounded at one end and sharpened at the other, but lack any extensive evidence of design or production. Oldowan tools were made by a Homo habilis individual, gripping a stone in each hand, swiping them together to force chips of stone to flake off of the intended tool, sharpening it in the process. The Oldowan tool industry and the specific names of the tool specimens recovered are derived from Tanzania's Olduvai Gorge, a key site known for harboring the remains of Homo habilis individuals. Mary Leakey, an accomplished British paleoanthropologist who lived from 1913 to 1996, was responsible for the area's discovery and naming, and some of the stone tools recovered at the gorge show sufficient evidence that some of these primitive men and women knew what they were doing. The Oldowan tools were just that, tools, specifically intended for their desired purpose, which shows a great leap forward in intelligence for these prehistoric apes. The evidence of flaking and chipping on the stones in Olduvai Gorge allow us to discern that the Homo habilis that made them knew what they were doing with the tools. They were more well-formed and advanced than the basic stone equipment made by the Australopithecines that preceded them, and we know that, from the tool's existence, that these individuals knew how to hit the stones together at exactly the right spots in order to make them flake off into a sharp point. This would have taken a comparatively high degree of intelligence, and thus far, at the time of their arrival in the world, Homo habilis were the most intelligent animals that have evolved yet. A new dawn was truly starting for not just the animal kingdom, but for the world. What we can tell, however, is that very little creative design went into constructing the Oldowan tools. There is no evidence that, with their slicing and cutting tools, Homo habilis were able to construct anything more advanced than a simple proto-bitface, an extremely early form of knife that would one day evolve with its creator to turn into a deadly spear tip or a sharp slicing knife. This tells us that Homo habilis was unlikely to have been a hunter. We know from the general structure and build of the animal's body and teeth that these early people were supplementing their vegetarian diet with helpings of meat, but they would have had very little means of obtaining much of it without the help of the local area's predators. It is, of course, entirely possible that unlucky or unwary small animals, or eggs, could have been caught with their grasping hands, equipped with powerful opposable thumbs, but they lack the capability to bring down bigger prey, such as antelope or other ungulates, equipped only with a simple stone cutting tool. Therefore, it is sensible to assume that the majority of meat in Homo habilis' diet came from the carcasses that had already been brought down by other carnivores. Like the vultures they shared the early Pleistocene plains with, they were scavengers. Still, the fact that these tools exist at all imply that Homo habilis has some form of understanding of simple mechanics in one way or another. It's surely a strange and even eerie thing to picture the big cats of the African savannah retreating away from a fallen antelope after eating their fill, only to be cautiously shadowed by a family of skulking Homo habilis, a creature so close and yet so far towards the path to Homo sapiens, clutching their stone-cutting tools and grunting to each other with their underdeveloped vocal cords, the same basic vocal noises that would one day lead to me presenting this very video you're watching. However, there is something else. In 1962, 2 years before Homo habilis was discovered, a strange circle of volcanic stones, over 4 meters long by 3 meters wide, was discovered in the Oldowan Gorge. These stones were firmly planted into the ground, between spaces of just over half a meter and at about 30 centimeters in height. This was certainly man-made. No other species known to science at the time could have put together such a structure, evenly spacing particular stones. Mary Leakey's theory on this structure is that some sort of early hominid used these rocks to support a pole, or support of some kind, possibly to create the most basic of primitive shelters or windbreaks, to guard the creatures from the pouring rain or blistering heat of Tanzania's savannas. These stones are the oldest known form of architecture known to man, and, although basic, laid the foundations for the mighty skyscrapers, monuments, and other structures of the modern day. It is, to this day, unknown which specific species of early human made this structure, but due to the age of the rocks and the location it was discovered, it has often been associated with Homo habilis. One other important point to make about Homo habilis' lifestyle and behavior is the potential practice of monogamy. They may have even been the first human species to do this. Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, 2 species which succeeded Homo habilis, are known to have mated for life, or to have had one partner at a given time, but it is speculated that this practice may have begun with their habilis predecessors. The communal structure that Homo habilis lived in has been previously compared to that of baboons, where multiple males coexist in a group with multiple females. Some of these groups may have numbered anywhere up to 80 individuals at one time. The males banded together to defend the troop from rivals or attackers, which may have involved Homo habilis individuals raising their arms, throwing sticks or stones, and repeatedly screeching at predators or rivals to intimidate them and scare them off. If it didn't work, Homo habilis would retreat to the relative safety of the trees, using their still elongated arms to grasp branches that would otherwise be hard to reach. The open savannas were a new and dangerous habitat for these apes, and danger could have been lurking behind any tree, rock, or grass patch. The savannas of Africa in the early Pleistocene were not too dissimilar in terms of the landscape and biome as the savanna grasslands of Tanzania today. Tall grasses, yellowish-green in color, would have spread out successfully across the dramatic open landscape, disturbed only by the odd patch of trees or rocks. Denser forests would have existed on the fringes of these mighty plains, and rivers would have still cut through the land, providing a vital water source for these early men. But as time went on, the Homo genus were becoming less and less adapted to a life in the trees. Their brains were growing. They were learning to walk and run permanently on their own 2 feet, and they were adapting to food sources that thrived in the great savannas of Africa. Nature was forcing them toward the plains, but they were by no means the only creatures out there. In fact, Homo habilis wouldn't even be the only species of hominid out on the savannas. 4 other species of hominid, 3 of which belong to the genus Homo, would occupy the savannas of Tanzania at the same time as our Homo habilis. And this was just the first time throughout prehistory that this would happen. Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, and Homo rudolfensis would be present throughout the time of habilis. But these are all creatures that we will be covering in further detail on this channel going forward. Ergaster and erectus specifically were species that succeeded habilis on these plains, and are in fact more closely related to you and I than their relatively primitive cousins. There was another creature that Homo habilis would have encountered on the plains, one uncannily familiar to its Australopithecus relatives, Paranthropus boisei. Sometimes, this creature is even referred to as Australopithecus boisei, due to the extreme similarities between the genuses, and are likely to have inhabited wooded wetlands or forests closer to the fringes of the savanna. Bulky, hairy, and bipedal, like the Australopithecus the habilises evolved from, it was definitely plausible that groups of Paranthropus boisei could have encountered large troops of Homo habilis as they wandered close to the fringes of each other's territories. What did they think when they met? Did they recognize each other as relatives, perhaps? Or did they just acknowledge them and slink away into the woods? We may never know. So where did the Homo habilis get the meat it relied upon for its balanced omnivorous diet? That answer can be found in the corpses of antelopes and horses, similar to the zebras and gazelles that populate the plains in vast herds today. These medium-sized ungulates would have been brought down by larger predators for the hominids and vultures to scavenge from later. But it is feasible to assume that all manner of creatures provided meat for these apes. Any large animal that fell or passed on the savanna could have been picked from. Perhaps Homo habilis consumed turtles or fish from the rivers when they could catch them, or caught small rodents or birds' eggs from the ground or up in the trees. Although Homo habilis was taking the first steps towards conquering the grasslands, it was by no means at the top of its ecosystem. Individuals that strayed too far from the group, youngsters, or the old and wounded, would have needed to be extra cautious when doing just about anything in Pleistocene Tanzania, for there were numerous threats waiting to claim an unwary early hominid. Australopithecus experienced it, and so did Homo habilis. Active predation from larger creatures. The savannas were plentiful with large carnivorous cats. Leopards, for example, similar to the ones alive today, would have been able to climb trees and pick off an unwary hominid, as well as stalking them on the ground in silence. Two extinct genuses of large cat were present on these plains too: Dinofelis and Megantereon, a deadly duo of saber-toothed cats. Megantereon in particular persisted through to the Middle Pleistocene, where it continued to pose a deadly threat to Homo erectus when they took over the savannas. It wasn't even just the cats that Homo habilis needed to be wary of. Africa at the time was populated by another extinct mammalian predator that would have stormed the plains in groups: the hunting hyena. Several species from the genus Chasmoporthetes were present in Africa at the time our ancestors were making their first upright steps. These hyenas ran on long, slender legs, similar to those of modern-day cheetahs, and likely pursued fast-moving prey across the grasslands. Our relatives would have been an easy catch, as they brought their quarries down with knife-like teeth. Homo habilis wasn't even safe when it needed to take a drink at the local rivers or lakes. Crocodiles were abundant in these areas, and it would only take a moment of carelessness to kneel down and drink, only to be met with the gaping jaws of a large carnivorous reptile, pulling an unwary ape down into the muddy waters. One Homo habilis fossil even shows an attack from a crocodile. The front half of the foot had been consumed or torn off by the reptile, which on the Pleistocene plains of Tanzania would have been a death sentence for a Homo habilis. It's hard to provide confident, accurate reasoning for the ultimate demise of Homo habilis. It is likely that, over the course of the Pleistocene, numerous factors contributed to the downfall of this early species. But one theory, from Dr. Pascal Raya, from the Università di Napoli Federico II in Italy, may have a very credible answer, published in the journal One Earth in 2020. Through looking at an advanced form of past climate emulator, Raya and colleagues were able to keep track of rainfall, temperature, and general climate over the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs. And from their results, it looks like later Homo species were beginning to lose access to their climatic niches across the world due to the sharp and rapid changes of climate across the globe. Environments that these early men and women relied upon began to disappear, and as a result, so did their food sources. Perhaps the same could be said for Homo habilis. Or perhaps this was just one factor in a plethora of others. It is also important to remember that Homo habilis coexisted with 3 other species of Homo throughout the time it was extant on Earth. Particularly, Homo ergaster and Homo erectus were more intelligent than the comparatively primitive habilis. So perhaps our apes were simply outcompeted by creatures that were better adapted to living and hunting in social groups across the plains of Tanzania. Whatever happened to the Homo habilis populations of Tanzania in the early Pleistocene, the Homo genus's legacy does not end here. This was just the beginning of a story that spans over 1 million years. A story that would culminate in this very moment in time. Other Homo species would persist, but it is Homo habilis that laid the foundations for them to do so. To you and I, they truly deserve their translated name, handyman. As the era of Homo habilis drew to a close, new species of humans were beginning to colonize Africa. It's strange to imagine living in a world with multiple species of human. But for much of the Pleistocene epoch of the Cenozoic era, this is exactly what was happening. Around 2 million years ago, a new creature began to revolutionize the animal kingdom, innovating in ways that were as of yet unimaginable. Continuing the trend of walking upright that was exhibited in the first few members of the Homo genus, this new creature was named Homo erectus, translating to upright man. Where Homo habilis was adapted to walking and climbing, Homo erectus took the first few steps towards a life lived entirely on the ground. It was a strange new world for these pioneering apes, and it is their unique behavior and lifestyle that has led to this species becoming synonymous with evolution. As they evolved, our ancestors were becoming more and more intelligent, more powerful, and more successful. Today, we will be exploring all aspects of the life of Homo erectus. What was it? What did it look like? How did it act and live? What was the world like at the time it lived? These are all questions that we will need to delve deep into the Pleistocene epoch to answer. A time of dramatic, untouched landscapes, dangerous megafaunal animals, and new and strange societies of early humans. Join us as we discover the amazing story of Homo erectus. As we covered in previous videos, Homo habilis, a species that preceded Homo erectus, would likely have looked out of place if you dressed an individual in modern clothes and asked them to walk down the street. With the ape's hairy body and long arms, you would likely recognize that this individual is not of the Homo sapiens species. You might not be able to say the same about Homo erectus, however. While hairier than a modern man, the general form of a human being had been mastered by evolution in the form of Homo erectus. As the name would suggest, this hominid walked upright in a manner pretty much similar to modern humans. Homo erectus would not have looked exactly like a modern human being. There were noticeable differences, but generally speaking, this species was the first in the Homo genus to look very much like you and I. The differences can mainly be found in the facial structure of Homo erectus. A protruding brow, sloping forehead, and outward-pushing jaws would have been key identifiable features that would separate a modern human from this early man. Homo erectus's face was also notably flatter than ours, with the exception of the nose. This hominid was the first species of human to possess a nose that projected out from the face, which evolved in response to changes in the air. As the air got drier, hominid noses grew bigger, allowing these early men and women to retain more moisture from otherwise arid environments. This allowed them to inhabit a wide range of areas, and Homo erectus was, across the course of its existence, a very successful species of hominid. Males and females of the species were pretty much the same size, with adults ranging between roughly 4 feet tall at the shorter end and 6 feet tall at the taller. As the hominids evolved, they began to grow taller. You would certainly notice a distinct height difference between the average Homo sapiens and the average Homo habilis, for example. But it almost began to plateau as Homo erectus appeared on the scene. Not only were their bodies more modernized, but so were their brains. The size of Homo erectus brains largely exceeded those of previous hominid species, such as Homo habilis and the Australopithecines. Brain capacity, however, progresses over the course of Homo erectus's time on Earth. Early populations of species indicate that brain development stopped during the early phases of childhood, vastly limiting the species' ability to learn throughout life. Individuals were mentally mature at a very young age from these old populations, whereas the newer populations typically continued to adapt mentally up until later stages of youth, more akin to modern humans. This allowed the species to learn at a steady rate, increasing Homo erectus's mental capacity and ultimately aiding the progression of higher intelligence in the genus. Debate exists as to whether or not Homo erectus may have emerged from a population of Homo habilis about 2 million years ago, but there is evidence that the two species coexisted, at least for a relatively short while, on a geological timescale from the Pleistocene epoch. That relatively short while was still 500,000 years, an awfully long time for individual bloodlines and populations. What seems more possible is the running theory that one particular population of Homo habilis may have become isolated by a physical geographical barrier in Africa. Perhaps this was some form of inhospitable land, such as a waterway, mountain range, or desert. As time progressed, the groups of Homo habilis in the rest of Africa continued to thrive, going about their daily lives as they scavenged the plains of sub-Saharan Africa. Meanwhile, however, the isolated population of Homo habilis was changing, steadily adapting via the means of natural selection to the new environment they had found themselves sealed within. They would have taken on new appearances, new adaptations, and eventually, after enough time, this population of Homo habilis would have progressed to the point where, logistically, science could no longer describe them as Homo habilis at all. With their upright stance, sparsely hairy bodies, and new facial structures, Homo erectus was born, as the theory goes. Still under debate, we may come to know just what caused the rise of Homo erectus in the future. Homo erectus persisted on Earth until just over 100,000 years ago. As it fades out from the fossil record, more human species begin to fade in. Homo erectus is thought to have been the direct ancestor to two highly important species in the Homo genus: Homo heidelbergensis, which was prominent across Europe, and Homo antecessor, which is known primarily from deposits in the Iberian Peninsula and Eastern Europe. Homo heidelbergensis, and consequently Homo erectus, are especially significant to our evolution, as heidelbergensis gave rise to the major human species of the late Pleistocene: Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals; Homo denisova, the Denisovans; and Homo sapiens, otherwise known as us. Homo erectus's last stand was a small population that persisted on the Indonesian island of Java. The subspecies was known as Homo erectus soloensis, with the very last specimens dating around 108,000 years old. It is possible that these populations gave rise to the island-dwelling Homo species, Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis, the former being the famous island dwarf human species, much smaller than the average modern man or woman. Climate change may have played a role in the demise of Homo erectus, especially the populations that persisted on throughout Asia when the Western groups had disappeared. Homo erectus soloensis is likely to have disappeared, ultimately when climate change transformed the open woodland favored by Homo erectus to tropical rainforest, more suited to the smaller island-dwelling species. The populations that did not evolve into new species could not adapt in time and perished in the change. Homo erectus is remarkably the first species of hominid to have ventured outside of Africa on a path to conquer the world. Specimens are known from much of Eurasia and Africa. The African continent is known to have harbored huge populations of these hominids, and fossils are known from almost all of Africa, with the exception of the Eastern Sahara region. The western half of the Arabian Peninsula was colonized, and populations are known to have traveled as far north from this region up to Turkey. Some groups of Homo erectus split off as they traveled north and moved into South, Southeast, and East Asia, with populations persisting in Pakistan, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, China, and the Korean Peninsula. Some populations even managed to move north from the edge of what is now Morocco up into Europe via the Iberian Peninsula, passing through Spain and Portugal into Western Europe. Homo erectus individuals are known from France, England, and the southern tip of Italy, showing that this species managed to stretch far and wide throughout the course of its existence. The furthest known Homo erectus from the African continent reached the island of Java in Indonesia by around 1.5 million years ago. And remarkably, two populations are known. Teeth uncovered in the region that are slightly larger than the older specimens indicate that there may have been a second group of Homo erectus that spread out across Java a few 100,000 years later, which points to the idea that populations of Homo erectus were constantly wandering, colonizing and discovering new territories across the East. As Homo erectus traveled, distinct subspecies began to pop up as the populations became isolated and concrete. Several distinct subspecies are noted from various points in geographical Homo erectus territory. In China, we find Peking Man. Southeast Asia is known for Java Man. Tutuvel Man can be found in the European populations. And Homo erectus ergaster has been unearthed from the groups that chose to stay in or return to Africa. The last one, Homo erectus ergaster, is a creature that has been the topic of much scientific debate as to whether or not it fits in its own subspecies, Homo ergaster, or if Homo erectus ergaster is simply a subspecies of Homo erectus. Taxonomy can be a tricky minefield of species, subspecies, and genuses, and scientists are constantly warring over opinions. But as it stands, it looks like ergaster is likely a subspecies of erectus and not a species in its own right. Amazingly, Homo erectus is known for possibly practicing the first verbal language, or proto-language, in the animal kingdom. It is still unclear as to whether or not this was a true, fully formed, and functioning language. But it does look as though these creatures were capable of a kind of advanced communication beyond the grunts, calls, and display signals of their ancestors. The best known Homo erectus example when discussing topics of speech is a hyoid bone discovered in the Castel di Guido area of Italy. This bone is bar-shaped, similar to the structure of modern human hyoid bones, rather than those of apes. Despite this, however, it lacks the muscle impressions that would have continuously impacted the bone over vocal use. The presence of this bone, along with the lack of development sufficient for modern speech, implies that while Homo erectus likely could not talk in a language as sophisticated as ones that exist today, it was likely to articulate its voice in calls and noises that sounded much more human-like than those made by Homo erectus. Uncannily human sounds, reminiscent of modern words, may have emerged from the throats of Homo erectus individuals as they wandered across the land or communicated with one another on hunts. Modern scientific theories suggest that Neanderthals and modern humans inherited speech from a common ancestor, which may well have been Homo erectus. But it would appear that it was Homo heidelbergensis, the species that bridged the gap between erectus and Neanderthalensis, that was the first of us to truly speak. Most of the heidelbergensis specimens that show evidence of speech have been found in similar areas in Spain. Perhaps this was the birthplace of language. Another interesting point to pick out regarding Homo erectus is its eating habits. Whereas Homo habilis was a scavenger, picking meat from carcasses on the vast open plains of Africa, Homo erectus was a predator, an apex predator. Archaeological sites concerning Homo erectus have been associated with the consumption of large mammals, specifically antelope, swine, and cattle. But in some circumstances, big game was favored. Troops of Homo erectus are known to have systematically hunted down animals as large as rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and elephants, and were intelligent enough to do this effectively as part of a team. They may also have been the first human species to live on a hunter-gatherer diet, as populations of Homo erectus in Israel have been associated with the consumption of over 50 different types of fruit and vegetables, as well as nuts and seeds. Diet presumably changed drastically, depending on what kinds of foods were available across the locations in which Homo erectus could be found. Larger creatures were likely taken in Africa, whereas north in Europe and east in Indonesia, diets would have differed greatly. Mammals were not the only creatures on the menu. Remains of fish, turtles, crocodiles, and amphibians also show clear signs of predation by Homo erectus. Our ancestors were, by this point, beginning to indicate that it was intelligence and not brute strength that could get you to the top of the food web. In order to consume and hunt such a wide variety of food sources, you needed to be able to craft tools. Without them, Homo erectus stood little chance of bringing down an elephant or hippopotamus. The Acheulean stone tool industry is most closely associated with this species of human, and Homo erectus was the first of our ancestors to procure deadly weaponry. Such objects that have been unearthed from archaeological dig sites include stone axes, knives, early pickaxes, and cleavers. These would have been invaluable in preparing food, but Homo erectus took it a step further and likely used some of these tools to cut wood. The earliest of these Acheulean stone tools comes from West Turkana, in what is now Kenya. Older Oldowan stone tools that were used by Homo habilis are found in the same site, which indicates a transition between the two styles. This coincides with about 1.5 million years ago, just a few 100,000 years after Homo erectus first appeared on the scene. These new humans were indeed smart, and they left their mark on the world to prove it. Some of the later Homo erectus subspecies in Java even managed to design and use bolas, a sophisticated stone tool procured from string and rocks, which strike and hold down prey when thrown. Homo erectus had one weapon in its arsenal that technologically surpassed all others, however: fire. For the first time, our ancestors were now using and controlling it, something that would revolutionize the world. Our previous video on the discovery of fire goes into much more detail on how early humans may have learned to harness the power of fire. But Homo erectus, again in Kenya, are known to have been the first early humans to transport fire from the wild to their settlements or caves. Through figuring out which materials burn slower than others, as well as finding the right way to strike rocks to create a spark, Homo erectus would have been able to start fire, not just use it. This would have been very much a trial and error system, where the technology was lost and gained over locations and generations multiple times. But eventually, around the end of the Homo erectus's evolutionary span, fire in the human archaeological record seems to have been a constant. As you keep yourself warm by the fire this winter, you know who to ultimately thank. Fire was used for many purposes: warmth, light, and perhaps even entertainment at first. Primarily, though, fire would have been used to make the first cooked food. Tools were used to cut or process hard foods, which were then added to the fire to improve the taste, increase nutritional value, or even to make some foods safe to eat. Trial and error again likely played a big part in the way this was discovered. But Homo erectus was some of the Homo genus's first chefs. Not only did Homo erectus harness advanced tools and fire, they were also known to have constructed basic dwellings. Scattered structures have been found in Africa, although scientists are unsure as to which Homo species these should be accredited to. As we venture north into Europe, we can see examples of basic shelters in what is now Germany and France, as well as the Czech Republic. Measuring around 3 meters by 4 meters and roughly 2 meters tall, these were very simple dwellings, made by manipulating branches to form a roof, which sat on additional branches that acted as supports or poles. These supports were wedged into a composite of rocks and mud at the base, which formed a very, very basic kind of building. These may have been used as temporary bases in the winter to guard Homo erectus from harsh snow and rain. Homo erectus are even accredited with forming the first examples of artwork or ritual activity. Individuals are known to have intentionally collected red ochre, which may or may not have been used as body paint in social or hunting activities. The Zhoukoudian area of China, where Peking man was evolving, sites have been found which indicate Homo erectus skulls, which have been smashed in, possibly by members of the same species. There is not enough evidence to prove exactly what happened, but some scientists have put forward the idea that these individuals were intentionally killed in order to consume the brains of the victims, which would paint a grisly beginning to a potential belief system or ritualistic behavior. It is also possible that scavenging animals could have contributed to this, but scientists are still in debate. In terms of their art, Homo erectus is credited with the first sculpture of a human figure. The Venus of Tantan, around 500,000 years old, was created by an erectus individual in what is now Morocco, showing that the species had some understanding of self-consciousness or creativity. Whether or not it is a self-portrait, a sculpture of a friend, or one of a perceived higher power is unknown. Homo erectus thrived across a huge range on 4 separate continents throughout its existence, and within those regions, there was a huge fluctuation in flora and fauna native to the region. The first Homo erectus evolved on the open plains of Africa, and as they spread out to different continents, would have encountered strange new environments unfamiliar to them. In the north, they would have encountered the mighty Sahara Desert before reaching the coastlines of North Africa and the Mediterranean. Colder mountainous regions, or woodlands, would have awaited them across the European continent to the north, whereas tropical forests and open woodland would have allowed them to thrive further south in Africa. As they ventured east, they would have encountered humid rainforests and more open woodlands, as well as more vast plains, wetlands, and coasts in the Indian subcontinent. Mountainous regions would have opened up to them in the south of China, and archipelagos and riverine wetlands would have been crossed in Southeast Asia. In these environments, whole hosts of new creatures were evolving that provided both food and major threats to our Homo erectus ancestors. In Africa, a land of strange giant herbivores and deadly feline carnivores, our ancestors would have been in a state of near constant danger. Elephants, such as Paleoloxodon, would have roamed these plains. One of the species actually hunted by these early men and women. Now extinct species of modern-day animals would have been abundant too. Horses, antelopes, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, and even some prehistoric ancestors of the giraffe. Other African creatures were a little less recognizable, however. Our ancestors may have hunted small herds of Coplocorus, a species of strange forest-dwelling hog, similar to the modern-day Red River hogs. Abundant in the Oligocene and Miocene, and Silotherium was a bizarre large herbivore that would have possibly been on the menu for some of the earlier populations of Homo erectus. A prime danger in the plains of Africa to our early ancestors would have been the big cat, Homo therium. Now extinct, this fanged predator is grouped colloquially as a scimitar-toothed cat, and likely would have been able to bring down unarmed, weak, or lone members of the Homo erectus populations conquering the world at the time. Traveling north via the Iberian Peninsula, a whole host of other creatures would have been encountered. Vast untouched populations of deer would have ran across the fields and through the woods of this new land, perhaps chased by wolves or other predators. Europe, from a landscape point of view, may not have looked too dissimilar to the way it does now. But several strange creatures joined Homo erectus in this land. Giant beavers, such as Trogantherium, would have made their homes along the waterways and lakes encountered by our ancestors, as occasional attacks from the large mustelid and Hydrictus took place. These large honey badger-like creatures would have been a nuisance at best, but may have proven deadly to young or sick members of the group. The existence of the famed mighty woolly rhinoceros, or Coelodonta, also coincides with the arrival of Homo erectus in Europe. It is highly possible that some of our first European pioneers may have locked eyes with these majestic creatures out on the open plains. The dramatic and varied landscapes of Asia would have brought a whole host of creatures with them for our ancestors to contend with. Deer, antelope, swine, cattle, and sheep would have been dispersed with the deadlier presence of leopards, tigers, and wild dogs, which would have proven to be a major threat to the early settlers in these regions. Whether they knew it or not, Homo erectus would also have encountered plenty of their own ancestors, primates, on the way over to Asia, in the various species of monkeys that thrived in the trees. One primate, however, stood taller than all others. Our early Homo erectus ancestors would have indeed met the mighty Gigantopithecus, the largest species of primate ever to exist. This extinct relative of the orangutan would have ambled through the forests of China around the same time the first Homo erectus were making their way through the region, which would have been a truly awesome sight indeed. Homo erectus populations in Indonesia are also known to have coexisted with and possibly contributed to the local extinction of Megalocalyes, a species of giant turtle native to the region. The lines of human evolution can often be blurred into obscurity, given the close proximity in terms of time of so many species of our genus. Species have been, in the past, renamed, reclassified, and combined, and today we will be examining this in action in the case of an archaic species of human, known as Homo heidelbergensis, a possible ancestor of Homo sapiens, and one of our closest ever relatives. The boundaries and similarities between our species and Homo heidelbergensis are in fact so similar that scientists are still considering the idea that heidelbergensis could indeed be a subspecies of Homo sapiens. In today's video, we will be exploring the life and evolution of Homo heidelbergensis, examining just what makes it so similar to our own species. We will look at how this species may have lived, where it lived, and how it was discovered. Although this is an archaic human with much to teach us, a wealth of information has been discerned from skeletal evidence found at archaeological dig sites, and we will be examining this information to put together Homo heidelbergensis' story. The mysterious and disputed Homo heidelbergensis has been known to modern humans since 1907, when an industrial worker in Mawa, a village not too far from the larger city of Heidelberg in Germany, uncovered a fossil jawbone jutting out from the rocks he was working in. Noting the importance of the find, the man extracted the bone from the rock and brought it to the famed anthropologist Otto Schoetensock, who, in the following year, officially named and described this species as a new archaic human, giving it the name Homo heidelbergensis, translating into English as Heidelberg Man, or the man from Heidelberg. The bone in question, a lower mandible jawbone, complete with a nearly full set of teeth, is thought to have belonged to a young adult of the species in life, determined by Otto Schoetensock based on the lack of wear and tear on the teeth. What prompted Otto to classify the Heidelberg Man as a new species of archaic human was the proportions of this jawbone. Compared to the mandible of a modern human, Homo heidelbergensis was huge, with a much bulkier form and shape to it than ours. If we ignore the controversies that have come out of this convoluted discovery, for now, then several other specimens have previously been assigned to Homo heidelbergensis. The best known of these specimens are fossils, mainly skull remains, discovered from various locations across Africa and Eurasia. Bones from Bodo in Ethiopia, Kabwe in Zambia, Ndutu in Tanzania, Petrolona in Greece, Aragu in France, and Dali in China have been uncovered across the course of time since the original mandible was discovered. All of these bones share remarkable similarities, specifically in the brow ridges and brain cases of the cranium bones. But Homo heidelbergensis is a species with a long and complicated history of debate, as we shall soon discover. Before we explore the complications of this heavily disputed species, let's take a look at what these scientists are working with. What actually was Homo heidelbergensis? What did it look like? And what can we discern about the species' appearance from the bones we have assigned to the species so far? Firstly, the basics. Homo heidelbergensis was a species of archaic human who existed in the Middle Pleistocene epoch of the Cenozoic era, from around 700,000 to 200,000 years ago. From the skull bones discovered across Africa and Eurasia, scientists have been able to determine that, in contrast to earlier species such as Homo erectus and Homo habilis, Homo heidelbergensis would have looked very similar to a modern human in life. On the skull bones, the nasal openings are vertically set, sometimes with a prominent crest. The attachment points for a nose very similar to that of our own. The teeth, often well preserved in the skulls, are similar and oriented in a very close fashion to that of our own, and features of the temporal bone on the skull indicate that the brain case of this species was rapidly growing. Not only did these humans look like us, they were beginning to think like us too. Paleoartists and scientists have even been able to piece together lifelike busts of Homo heidelbergensis's head and face, based on fossil evidence. Some of these can be seen at the London Natural History Museum's exhibit on human evolution. Although scientists have not yet uncovered many bones from the torso and limbs of Homo heidelbergensis, they have been able to infer what this species may have looked like in full, based on its position in the family tree, using older and later species to determine a body plan. Using this method, alongside the factoring in of several long bones, such as tibias and femurs from African and European specimens, scientists have suggested that, on average, a male Homo heidelbergensis individual was between 5'7" and 5'10" in height, whereas females were between 5'2" and 5'7" on average. Although slightly shorter than modern humans, this was a significant increase from the Australopithecines and early members of the Homo genus from the early to middle Pleistocene. These later species were evolving longer legs to help them cover greater distances, which can be seen firsthand inbuilt in the massive range of similar fossils across Africa and Eurasia. Later species of humans to exist throughout the Pleistocene tended to branch off into two slightly varying body plans. More common was the stocky, more barrel-shaped body, akin to that of a Neanderthal or Denisovan, a well-adapted body style for the harsh northern climates of Eurasia. Also found in archaic humans was the more Homo sapiens-like form, more narrow-chested and slender than other species. It is thought that, while these Middle Pleistocene humans were increasing in height, they still tended to adhere to the body plan that would later become synonymous with the Neanderthals. Homo heidelbergensis, therefore, possessed a bulky, stocky body plan, with a broad pelvis and thick leg bones. This was likely an adaptation to help this species adapt to cooler climates in the north of Eurasia, something that older species such as Homo habilis and Homo erectus, known for their affinity with warmer climates, lacked. The controversy began in the 1950s with the anthropologist Ernst Mayr, noting the extreme diversity of the number of species of archaic human popping up throughout the course of the Middle Pleistocene. He decided to recognize only 3 of them: Australopithecines, defined by Homo transvalensis; archaic humans, defined by Homo erectus; and modern humans and Neanderthals, defined by Homo sapiens. Every known species of human, from the last Australopithecine to the evolution of our own species, would be lumped into the Homo erectus bracket, with a view to making them all obsolete. This included Homo heidelbergensis, whose name would nearly fade into obscurity over the coming decades, as Mayr's take on ancient humans impacted the way we think about them. Today, Mayr's claims are disputed. Many of the species assigned to the Homo erectus species by him in the 1950s have in recent years been noted for their differences and diversity, and many paleontologists, anthropologists, and archaeologists are quick to determine them as separate, valid species in their own rights. Francis Clark Howell, an American anthropologist, was the first to lead the charge on opposing Mayr's views, alongside the British Chris Stringer. They noted the similarities between several specimens of species that were previously assigned to Homo erectus to those of our own species, opting to reassign them to Homo sapiens. Cracks started to show in Mayr's original theory, and Stringer suggested that Homo heidelbergensis, amongst a few other species snubbed by Mayr, should be reintroduced to the genus as their own distinct species, to highlight the differences between them and the specimens newly assigned to Homo sapiens. Stringer did a lot of work to help Homo heidelbergensis become a widely used and recognized species of archaic human once more. Further studies on North African and European human fossils have led to many specimens across these areas being assigned to Homo heidelbergensis, and most remains from these areas, dating around 600,000 to 300,000 years ago, are typically assigned to this species. Later, in 2010, American anthropologist Jeffrey H. Schwartz, along with paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall, took this a step further, suggesting that all specimens from Middle Pleistocene Europe and Asia should be classified as Homo heidelbergensis. Upon the recognition of the Denisovans, an archaic species of Pleistocene human we have previously covered on this channel, this theory became less and less popular, with a lot of Asian specimens being presumed to be Denisovans. All of these factors and more, when other species are brought into the mix, factor towards the Middle Pleistocene epoch's infamous nickname among anthropologists and archaeologists, the muddle in the middle. It is very difficult to discern at this point which species are distinct and which are subspecies, or specimens of known species, alongside figuring out which species evolved from and possibly into which. This is due to the large number of recognized species from this period in time, and Homo heidelbergensis has fallen victim to much debate as a result over the years since its discovery. Due to similarities and proximity in terms of time to Homo sapiens, some researchers have determined that Homo heidelbergensis should be placed within our very own species, and that the known fossils of Homo heidelbergensis represent a subspecies of Homo sapiens living in the earlier stages of the Pleistocene. William Strauss, an anthropologist who studied the original mandible, discovered in 1907 in Mawa, Germany, has previously said about the find, "While the skull is the creation of God, the jaw is the work of the devil," in reference to the confusion it caused. Mariana Roxanich, a Canadian anthropologist, is the most recent researcher to weigh in on Homo heidelbergensis. Mariana and colleagues have proposed that the name Homo heidelbergensis, along with that of the contemporary fossil human Homo rhodesiensis, should be completely wiped from the record. The team have suggested that all specimens of Homo heidelbergensis from Europe should be classed as Neanderthals in the species Homo neanderthalensis, whilst Homo rhodesiensis specimens should be moved to a new catch-all term for African specimens, Homo bodoensis. The team also came up with an explanation for all the confusion. Potentially, Homo bodoensis and what was once considered to be Homo heidelbergensis periodically migrated across Africa and Eurasia between glacial cycles. On the way, they would have come into contact with indigenous populations of archaic humans, where they would likely interbreed. So where does Homo heidelbergensis stand today? Chris Stringer, who has worked extensively on Homo heidelbergensis, along with other researchers, unsurprisingly reject the claims made by Roxanich and the team, as they felt that their research did little to help us resolve the story of Homo heidelbergensis. Through changing the names of species at will, they also broke the rules of scientific binomial naming. As it stands, Homo heidelbergensis is valid, but for how long? Homo heidelbergensis, it has been determined, was one of the first humans to be more strictly carnivorous than other species that preceded it. These were omnivorous humans, but ones that had become highly skilled at filling the apex predator spot on the food chain. A better understanding of weaponry and hunting techniques allowed these early people to hunt big game, actively stalking and pursuing it across the steppes and forests of the Middle Pleistocene. Communities of human thought to belong to Homo heidelbergensis, living in the Terra Armata site on the slopes of Mount Bahon next to Nice, France, are known to have been hunting a wide variety of large and dangerous animals. Deer formed a large part of their diet, as did ibexes, cattle, horses, and boars. But on occasion, possibly when food was more scarce, or when the opportunity presented itself, these people would take prey as large as elephants. Archaic species of elephant, as well as rhinoceroses, would have been challenging yet possible kills for Homo heidelbergensis, whose communities would have efficiently worked together on elaborate plans to bring down these animals. As archaic humans hunted meat, natural selection set to work in improving these people's abilities to hunt. Larger brains led to better hunting strategies, which led to the ability to hunt larger and more complicated prey. It is thought that, when hunting, Homo heidelbergensis teams worked together to herd prey animal into environmental features that were difficult to escape. Larger animals, such as elephants, may have been chased into swamps or marshes before being circled and killed with sharp spears and points. Meat was not the only food source on the menu for Homo heidelbergensis, however, and communities of these humans are known to have taken a wide range of berries and nuts, and possibly even tree bark. To counteract the threats of protein poisoning inflicted by a consumer of a diet with a very high meat content, a large deal of carbohydrates would need to be consumed. Plant matter does not fossilize as well as animal bones, and for the time being, we cannot determine too much about the plant-based food intake of Homo heidelbergensis. But it is known that the Schöningen site in Germany, associated with high-quality hominid finds, is home to over 200 plants that can be safely eaten, uncooked or otherwise. Given that these plants were likely present at the same time Homo heidelbergensis was present on the scene, it is safe to assume that many of them would have found their way into the diets of this species. It is in Homo heidelbergensis that we see some of the earliest evidence for what could be considered to be art. Engravings and carvings have been uncovered across the areas where Homo heidelbergensis would have been living that bear no logical explanation other than a symbolic one, indicating that these people may have been carving simple patterns or lines into rocks for fun, or to make a note of something. Such structures have been found across France and Germany. Potential jewelry has even been discovered from Europe in the form of perforated sponge fossils, which may have been threaded together to form charms or beads on a necklace or bracelet. These structures appear to have been deliberately chosen due to their round form and presence of holes, which were cut through to create a bead-like structure. We also know that many humans from this period in time were utilizing ochre to create a paint-like substance. Red ochre is particularly common. Scientists have suggested perhaps due to the fact that it bears a similar color to that of blood. At the Terra Armata site near France, over 70 pieces of ochre have been found that are thought to have been mixed to achieve different shades of reds, yellows, browns, and oranges. This indicates that these people had a preference for the color they used to decorate their structures and potential artwork, meaning they had a basic understanding of creativity and design. One of the most intriguing questions surrounding ancient species of humans concerns their ability to speak and formulate a language. Could they do it? Or did they communicate more in a series of incoherent grunts and whoops? Bones thought to belong to Homo heidelbergensis from Spain indicate that the hyoid bone in Homo heidelbergensis was well developed, similar in fact to those of our own. The bone was set far enough in the skull to support the tongue, and the middle ear bones were developed well enough to allow these people to distinguish the frequencies associated with human speech. Even more remarkably, it is thought that these people were predominantly right-handed, due to the articulation of marks and striations in the teeth, which is associated with the same section of the brain which is also associated with language production and speech. Therefore, It is thought that if these specimens do represent Homo heidelbergensis, then the species was capable of speaking in an early form of language. Although, due to the fact that these people were a long way from developing any form of writing, we have no way of determining what exactly it sounded like. Homo heidelbergensis were therefore a highly social species, which would have lived and hunted in groups of families and friends, communicating with and learning from one another as they survived the wilds of Pleistocene Eurasia. Little is known about the specific social structure of these humans, but it is thought that they buried their dead, based on the remains of 28 individuals from Spain. This points to one of two things: a broad awareness of the risk presented by decomposing dead bodies close to a community, or an early belief system associated with death, a possible afterlife, and sentimentality. Homo heidelbergensis are among the first humans to have made tools, classed as belonging to the Acheulean stone tool industry, which was prominent across the early Stone Age. This industry replaced the Oldowan stone tool industry, used by species such as Homo erectus. Amongst the Acheulean stone tools produced by Homo heidelbergensis, we can see simple yet symmetrical hand axes, which were specifically crafted to be more lightweight than their predecessors. To become lighter and easier to wield, Homo heidelbergensis designed these tools to be smaller and thinner, a technique achieved by striking the axe from either side with a hammer-like structure, likely composed from a second stone. It is also thought that Homo heidelbergensis had access to specifically prepared platforms, or basic table-like slabs, which were reserved for tool preparation. Carved from large pieces of rock, materials required to make specific tools would have been brought to the platform in order to maximize accuracy when constructing a tool. The process of making these hand axes would have resulted in large chips and flakes of rock being sheared off, but these were still useful. It is thought that Homo heidelbergensis, alongside other Middle Pleistocene hominids, may have recycled excess materials created when constructing tools, shaping them into smaller tools that would have been able to suit more specific, intricate jobs. The existence of stone platforms used for designing tools indicates that these people had an understanding of prerequisite technologies, otherwise known as hierarchical organization, which was a huge step forward for human species going on to create more complex structures later on down the line. Some groups of humans around this time also began to make their tools from bone and deer antler, each of which would have required different techniques and levels of force to construct, pointing towards the fact that these humans had an understanding of planning, design, and material choice. It is possible that Homo heidelbergensis may have been the first human species to produce blades from stone. In rocks belonging to the Kapthuran Formation, in what is now modern Kenya, blade-like structures have been found, thought to have been intentionally carved by a species of human, who may or may not have been Homo heidelbergensis. These blades and bladelets have been determined to date to around 540,000 years ago, and may have been used as a form of defense or offense against wild animals. It cannot be determined if this technology was passed down from previous generations, or if blade making was a technology that had been lost and rediscovered multiple times, across the human evolutionary story. On top of this, Homo heidelbergensis is thought to have been the first human species able to harness the technology of hafting. This involves the attaching of stone points to sticks in order to make basic spears. At the Schöningen site in Germany, a total of 9 spears and spear fragments have been uncovered and are thought to have belonged to Homo heidelbergensis. Some of these spears are remarkably complex. One exceptionally long spear could be classed as a basic lance, and one of the spears even has an attachment point for a sharpened stone on both ends. The spears were made from spruce and pine wood, and when fully assembled could have been up to 2.5 meters in length. It is likely that these spears could have been held as melee weapons at close range, for keeping animals such as bears and wolves at bay, or thrown or stabbed into the flank of a prey animal in order to cause a potentially fatal wound. It is thought that these spears, given their size and the strength of the individuals throwing them, could have been launched 35 meters through the air, but would have been more effective the closer the thrower was to the target. It is from this technology that humans eventually discovered how to craft more complex and powerful weaponry, including hafted blades and axes. Although evidence for fire use amongst humans is uncommon in the fossil record until around 400,000 years ago, we do know that Homo heidelbergensis would have been able to harness and utilize it effectively. Homo erectus, the species that preceded Homo heidelbergensis, were already utilizing and harnessing fires in their hunts, which proved to be an extremely effective tool for both bringing down large animals and cooking their meat after. It is thought that the species that followed Homo erectus were able to take this a step further and maintain and manage their fires in a controlled setting. Homo heidelbergensis hunting parties would likely have brought fire along with them to attack large animals such as elephants and rhinoceroses, which would have been extremely effective against these animals' tough defensive hides. Finally, Homo heidelbergensis is thought to have constructed basic shelters to defend themselves against the elements when cave space was scarce or occupied by other species. These structures were very simple and have been found across Europe in areas sheltered from the weather, such as against the faces of rocks or cliffs. Basic foundations of rocks and earth hold thick pole-like branches in place to support a basic roof made of thinner branches. These structures typically measure 3 meters by 3.5 meters, and it is thought that they were built in early winter, occupied throughout the harshest season, and were only used for sleeping in at the time. All evidence of fire use in early hominids appear to have taken place in the entrances of caves or outside altogether, likely to prevent the dangers of smoke or a spreading dangerous fire from affecting the group. Much of the environment traversed by Homo heidelbergensis would have consisted of steppes and forests, cool and cold in temperature to the north. To the south, in the lower reaches of Europe and the vast swaths of Africa, grasslands and plains would have dominated the landscape, offset by patches of forest and the occasional mountain. Homo heidelbergensis was an adaptable and hardy species that could therefore inhabit a wide variety of ranges and environments, and could have exploited a plethora of food sources in these environments. alongside the food sources associated with the species, many dangers would have been present across the ranges they inhabited. Rival groups of Homo heidelbergensis could have posed a significant threat, especially if times were tough. Dangerous mammals, such as bears and wolves, are known across the Eurasian ranges, and large, powerful species of cat could be found throughout Africa across the time Homo heidelbergensis was present on the scene. Add to that the presence of dangerous herbivores, such as hippopotamuses and rhinoceroses, and carnivorous reptiles such as snakes and crocodilians, and you have a dangerous range of environments that could have quickly proved lethal for a young, sick, inexperienced, or elderly Homo heidelbergensis individual. These early humans needed to be hardy and defensive if they were to survive in these harsh landscapes. So how did Homo heidelbergensis initially come to be? The species is in fact thought to have evolved directly from populations of Homo erectus in Africa, around 700,000 years ago. This is a process that is thought to have begun around 2 million years ago, during the migration of hominins out of Africa and into the wider ranges of Eurasia. Returning briefly to the debate on how Homo heidelbergensis should be classified, some scientists believe that Homo erectus split into Homo heidelbergensis in the north and Homo rhodesiensis in the south, while other scientists believe that Homo heidelbergensis occupied both regions as the same species. It is commonly thought that Homo heidelbergensis is the ancestor of modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. But Spanish archaeologist José María Bermúdez de Castro came up with a differing theory in 1997. He suggested that, at the time, the newly discovered Homo antecessor, known from Spain, represented the ancestor of just Homo sapiens, and that Homo heidelbergensis represented a different line, descending from Homo antecessor into Neanderthals and Denisovans separately. If his theory were true, that would mean that we are not directly descended from Homo heidelbergensis, and that the last common ancestor we share with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans would be Homo antecessor. Interestingly, Jose later backtracked on this opinion and returned to the original belief that Homo heidelbergensis was the last common ancestor of Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. It was later discovered, based on evidence collected from Homo antecessor teeth, by paleoanthropologist Frido Velker in 2020, that Homo antecessor was not an ancestor to Homo heidelbergensis, and the species were in fact sister lineages. This segment may in fact have a misleading title, as Homo heidelbergensis is thought to have evolved into our species, rather than having gone extinct. That being said, only select populations of Homo heidelbergensis would have transitioned into our own species, those who adapted to the changing world. Climate change and a potential lack of food sources in some regions may have driven the Homo heidelbergensis individuals who failed to adapt to their demise, with only the successful genes being passed on to the descending species. As the climate changed, towards the end of the Homo heidelbergensis's appearance in the fossil record, the environment and the food within it would also have begun to alter. The disappearance of food sources that the species relied on in certain areas such as the megafaunal mammals such as elephants and rhinoceroses, would have caused a massive struggle amongst existing communities. And one by one, the groups that could not adapt faded into the depths of prehistory. The same thing would happen to their eventual ancestors, the Neanderthals, later on in the Pleistocene. Obviously today, it is only Homo sapiens that persist, and we are left solely with important archaeological finds, such as those unearthed in Germany and Spain, to remind us of our lineage. What comes to mind when you think of a Neanderthal? Even though perceptions of these ancient humans have changed drastically over the past few decades, it is still likely that the word is synonymous with brutish, primitive, knuckle-dragging apes. The classic image of Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthal, is that of a dim-witted savage, wielding a colossal club, which it uses to bash its tribe mates on the head. 20th century pop culture is full of these depictions, and general publics all over the world have come to know the Neanderthal as a monster, a subhuman, more ape than man. The reality could not be more different. Homo neanderthalensis was in fact as human as you and I. They lived complicated lives. They created music and art. They were exceedingly intelligent. And they even interbred with us, the first Homo sapiens. That's right. It's more than likely that your DNA contains that of the Neanderthals that were roaming much of the northern hemisphere in the late Pleistocene epoch. These early men and women were just that, men and women. Although they belonged to a different species to our ancestors, they were just as human as you and I, only in their own way. Obviously, there are no living, breathing Neanderthals around today. But we do know they coexisted with our ancestors. So what happened to them? Where did they all go? Today, we will be answering these questions and more as we take an in-depth look at Homo neanderthalensis, some of our closest cousins in the hominid world. We will look at many aspects of Neanderthal life as we do so: their culture, their lifestyles, their evolution, and their appearances. Join us as we take an intriguing trip into the lives, loves, and legacies of Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. Homo neanderthalensis appeared on the scene between 315,000 years ago and 430,000 years ago. Studies are still incomplete as to exactly when the first Neanderthals began to evolve, but it seems to be that they began to appear gradually within this time frame, which is a tiny step on the grand geological scale of life. Imagine the geological timescale of planet Earth on a timeline spanning 1 year. The dawn of time is January 1st, and right now is December 31st. The Neanderthals appeared and disappeared within roughly a minute or two on this scale. We are much, much closer to them than you might think. The average Neanderthal would have been noticeably different to the Homo sapiens they shared the planet with. At first glance, these men and women would have been difficult to tell apart from those of our own species, but a close-up encounter would certainly aid to identify them. The average Neanderthal was shorter and stockier than the average Homo sapiens. They were built much bulkier to help them withstand the brutal elements of their Ice Age homes, with wider arms and legs. Their torsos were barrel-shaped, with thick, curved ribs and wide pelvises to further aid success in this harsh lifestyle. The face of a Neanderthal was also easy to tell apart from that of a modern human. Their brows protruded further than ours. Their chins were straight and short. Their foreheads sloped slightly, and their noses were large, broad, and flat to help filter the cold air. The Neanderthals were much more well adapted to the colder, freezing climates of the northern hemisphere. And that is just where they lived. Neanderthals were native to Eurasia until about 40,000 years ago, when they began to mysteriously disappear from the fossil records of the time. Large populations of Neanderthals were focused in Western Europe, specifically across the Iberian Peninsula, France, and Germany. Germany, in particular, is a wonderful site for Neanderthal fossils, and many populations have been unearthed in the region. Small populations of Neanderthals even managed to make it to the British Isles, where they thrived alongside our earliest ancestors for a while. As one travels east towards Asia, Neanderthal populations begin to become more few and far between as you approach Central Asia. But the species thrived in the cold north, up towards Siberia, the Baltic Sea, and Scandinavia. Populations of Neanderthal are indeed known from warmer climates in Central Asia and the Middle East, but Neanderthals did better further away from these warmer climates, favoring the wide-open steppes, tundra, and plains, and the now extinct megafauna that lived alongside them. The prime habitat of the Neanderthal was the mammoth steppe, planet Earth's most extensive continuous biome. Characterized by an abundance of grasses, sparse woodlands, and huge Pleistocene mammals, the mammoth steppe is the environment we most closely associate with the Ice Age. It spanned for much of Homo neanderthalensis' range, right through from the western Iberian Peninsula, right the way through to the eastern coast of Russia, even spilling over into Canada. As the Earth began to warm towards the end of the Pleistocene, the mammoth steppe disappeared, and so did many of its inhabitants. The Neanderthal life cycle was similar to that of modern-day human beings. It is theorized that, while ancestral species such as Homo habilis and Homo erectus typically matured very fast, later species such as Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens opted to delay their maturity till later on in life, to allow their brain to develop further. As such, it is likely that Neanderthals and modern humans reached maturity at a similar stage in life. Their gestation periods were probably very similar, and females typically would have reached menopause at a similar time to modern women. It is these coinciding features that may have encouraged Neanderthals to begin interbreeding with Homo sapiens. The Neanderthals were, all in all, perfectly adapted to their environments. Their barrel-shaped bodies and tough, thick limbs allowed for a great deal of physical strength and resistance against the elements, be that from freezing weather or attacks from tough megafaunal mammals. Their large bodies and short statures would have helped them to retain body heat better than Homo sapiens would have been able to, allowing them to populate the regions further north than our ancestors did, helping them to avoid competition for food. Their noses, broad and flat, would have been able to filter the cold air well. and the species would have found it much easier to breathe in the frigid northern realms of Eurasia. When written out in black and white, it looks as though the Neanderthals were much better suited to a life on the freezing tundra than we Homo sapiens were. But the existence of the Neanderthal into the modern day was not to be. Just less than 500,000 years ago, Neanderthals began to appear on the fossil record across Eurasia. Homo heidelbergensis, a descendant of Homo erectus, which thrived in the Middle Pleistocene epoch across Europe and possibly Asia and Africa, was the species that would give rise to Homo neanderthalensis around this time. A lot of confusion and debate still continues to persist around just when Neanderthals officially first appeared on the scene. But it seems to be that it was this species and roughly this time that the scales started to tip towards Homo heidelbergensis becoming an intelligent new species, separating from itself into two different directions. One branch of Homo heidelbergensis would split off and become Homo neanderthalensis, whereas another would go a separate way, evolving to become Homo sapiens, us. Again, experts are not 100% certain as to what exactly happened to cause this taxonomical split. The leading theory is that geographical isolation played a part, as it did with the separation of Homo habilis into Homo erectus millennia prior to this. Scientists propose that a population of Homo heidelbergensis around the time that Neanderthals began to appear were isolated by a geographical barrier, in this case, a massive glaciation event. Successfully adapting to this new environment instead of succumbing to the harsh climate, the population began to change. They became bulky and more visually human-like. They began to breed, form communities, and adopt this new glacial lifestyle as one they would favor, and became known as a new species, the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals, once they adapted to their new home, were then able to spread themselves out, conquering new territories across the wild northern realms of Eurasia. As they evolved and thrived, they became more intelligent, harnessing the power of new and powerful technologies, such as fire, weaponry, and clothing. They would bump into an array of new creatures that they were able to both interact with and hunt. New species of human, such as us, and the now extinct Denisovans, Homo denisova. The new species of megafauna, some of which were also newly evolved from the glaciation event, were prime targets for this powerful new hunting technology, and the Neanderthals thrived on these steps for many thousands of years. We have lots of compelling evidence that Homo neanderthalensis populations coexisted and interacted with other species of human. After the Neanderthals evolved and started to spread out across the northern continents, they would have begun to encounter strange creatures that looked almost like themselves. Taller, lighter humans with more angular faces and complex communicative abilities would have been found further south. These were the earliest members of our own species, Homo sapiens. As the Neanderthals began to conquer the East, they would have caught rare glimpses of a creature which perhaps looked more similar to themselves. The Denisovans, or Homo denisova, a mysterious and controversial taxon that may or may not have been its own species, populated the northern reaches of Siberia and much of East Asia. It's amazing to think about how these early encounters must have played out. What would have gone through the mind of the first Homo sapiens as they discovered that other sapient species were emerging on the steppes? Did they even recognize them as different? What about the Denisovans? We can't even say for sure what this species looked like, so what must the Neanderthals have thought as family groups intertwined for the first time? What we do know is that many of these interactions were likely non-confrontational. Quite the opposite, in fact. Substantial evidence exists that Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens interbred, and often did so. That evidence is overwhelming in the modern day, now that scientists have sequenced the genome of multiple human races and species. All non-sub-Saharan genomes within the Homo sapiens species, for example, contain Neanderthal DNA. This is most prominent in modern Europeans and Asians, which coincide with the Neanderthals' historic home territories. The average modern European human is made up of anywhere between 1.8% and 2.4% of Neanderthal DNA, and the average modern Asian human is made up of anywhere between 2.3 and 2.6% of Neanderthal DNA. The fact that these two species interbred is not just a theory. It is hard-proven scientific fact. Interspecific families, and perhaps even groups, may have existed across the steppes of the late Pleistocene. Fascinating scenarios where hybrid children were accompanied by parents from both sapiens and Neanderthalensis descent. Again, it is unknown just how common these occurrences were. But for modern humans to contain noticeable traces of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, it must have been more common than you'd expect. Evidence also persists, albeit more sparsely, that Neanderthals interbred with the Denisovans they encountered on the Asian continent, up in Siberia and towards the center. One thing that can be discerned when comparing Homo sapiens to Homo neanderthalensis is that human technology was ultimately more advanced than Neanderthal technology. This is just one theory which has been put forward to justify the Neanderthals' demise. Perhaps they simply could not compete. As human numbers increased, Neanderthal populations may have dwindled as Homo sapiens used their tools and knowledge to conquer wider swaths of land. Territories may have begun to cross over one another, and it wouldn't have been long before the two species were competing for survival. This theory concludes that the humans, with their superior technologies, eventually outlasted their Neanderthal cousins. The first thing that can be said about the lifestyle of a Neanderthal is that it wasn't an easy life. These men and women led short, violent lives, which is part of the reason why their bodies needed to be so stocky and robust. Studies show that between 79 and 94% of all known Neanderthal specimens hold evidence of healed major traumas. A good example of this is that of a specimen known as Shanidar 1, taken from a cave in northern Iraq. This individual shows evidence of a right arm amputation, an infection of the bone where the arm was amputated, issues with vision, and possible hearing loss. Perhaps the Neanderthal in question sustained these injuries from an animal attack or interspecific combat. It is therefore estimated, when analyzing the ages of the individuals known to science, that over 80% of Neanderthals perished before they reached 40 years of age. It was a dangerous and brief life out on the mammoth steppe. The majority of known Neanderthal injuries are thought to have been sustained from attacks from wild animals. As the climate grew colder, the animals of the steppe grew bigger and more dangerous, and many of them sought shelter from the elements in caves. The Neanderthals wanted these caves for themselves, and often found themselves fighting for competition over cave space with the deadly carnivorous mammals that had taken up residence therein, meaning that such attacks were frequent and life-threatening. Hunting would have also caused severe injuries, as would have intergroup conflicts. Some Neanderthals are known to have sustained major blade wounds to the head and torso, indicating that, while they might have had friendly relations with our ancestors, tensions between rival groups may have been high on a conspecific level. Taking a look at just what the Neanderthals were hunting can also give us some insight as to why some of these injuries were so common. They were one of the first human species to hunt challenging big game. They are known to have primarily taken medium-sized ungulates, such as red deer, ibex, and reindeer. But the steppe was rife with opportunity, and larger creatures were often systematically hunted. These include woolly rhinoceroses, aurochs, straight-tusked elephants, and the iconic woolly mammoths. As you can probably imagine, these wouldn't have been the easiest hunts, when all you had to defend yourself was a spear. Not all Neanderthals appear to have tackled such challenging prey though, and as we move around the world, we see different cuisines start to take hold. While populations in the north hunted megafauna, coastal groups in Gibraltar appear to have eaten smaller prey, such as game birds. Quails and corncrakes, as well as several species of lark, were consumed in these societies. But due to their proximity to the coast, seafood was a speciality. Everything from shellfish to tuna, right through to dolphins and seals, were killed, butchered, and consumed by the Neanderthals living in these coastal Iberian groups. But certain populations took their diets a step further still. Some vegetarian communities are known from inland Spain, where the Neanderthals living there rarely needed to hunt. The nutrients they needed came from wild mushrooms, various species of mosses, and pine nuts that grew in the area. Most Neanderthal communities were notoriously skilled cooks and could adapt and prepare various types of food in various different ways. Food was roasted, boiled, and eaten raw, and some communities are known to have prepared complex meals and broths out of the local ingredients. Many societies were traditional hunter-gatherers, relying upon many sources of food to satiate their hunger. The megafauna hunters of the north were not strict carnivores and would have supplemented their diet with vegetables. These hunter-gatherer societies ranged in size from around 10 individuals to up to 30 in larger settlements, and both men and women are known to have shared labor. Both sexes took part in all manner of jobs, from hunting to cooking, to crafting and scouting. The Neanderthals are also known for their complex tools and primitive technologies. They are associated with the Mousterian stone tool industry, which saw many new objects, structures, creations, and weapons arise. Neanderthals are known to have used javelins, spears, and knives as weapons and tools to hunt and craft, but it doesn't stop there. Some communities may have used darts to subdue their prey. Specialized scrapers were used to butcher animals, and needles were used to craft early clothes. These clothes probably weren't too complex and were likely ill-fitting, but they did the job of keeping individuals warm in patches of cold weather. These simple clothes were made from animal hide and fur, and would have been similar to blankets or ponchos used and worn by modern humans. Some groups of Neanderthals are known to have harnessed the power of birch bark tar, a sticky substance found in birch trees that helped these early men and women to construct their weapons and tools. Some communities in the Ionian Sea are even known to have developed basic seafaring tools, rafts and paddles that could transport individuals across bodies of water for a short time. Neanderthals even pushed the boat out in terms of their medicinal capabilities. Some sites show extensive use of splint settings on bones to cure injuries, and a wide range of medicinal plants were acknowledged, collected, and consumed to kill pain or help with disinfection. The Neanderthals are also known to be keen and skilled users of fire. They were adept in starting fires to their advantage in order to cook food, aid in hunts, or to keep communities warm in the harsh climates of the Pleistocene Ice Age. Fire was either transported or started in order to aid the family groups, and it may have been a key component of the weaponry that allowed them to bring down creatures as large and powerful as the woolly mammoths of the vast mammoth steppes. From these fires, Neanderthals built stone hearths in caves that would burn throughout the winter to keep societies warm. The presence of such hearths also indicate that they had some knowledge of air circulation, building the hearths in specific locations with ventilation, so members of the group would not choke on the fumes injected into the caves from the hearth fire's smoke. There would have been some trial and error in all of this technology, and certain abilities would have taken the Neanderthals longer to master than others. Some Neanderthals in what is now France are thought to have had access to and knowledge surrounding basic string and cordage, which could have allowed for the production of a wide range of tools and objects, which would have made life much easier for these early men and women. With string, they could have harnessed nets to catch fish and other animals, beds within their cave homes, shoes to protect and warm their extremities, and simple walls and flooring to create huts or tents. Carrying devices, such as woven baskets, could have been constructed with string, as could have tie ropes to secure traps. The examples go on, but if Neanderthals did use string in these ways, there may be a lost world of primitive technology that is waiting to be discovered. Neanderthals also had a specific culture that separated them from that of Homo sapiens. It is vague and unknown if Neanderthals followed a certain set of beliefs or religion, but they did bury their dead, which could denote to a belief in some sort of afterlife or basic rituals around passing on. Neanderthal graves are known across their territories. Some individuals may have even worn simple, primitive jewelry made out of stones, bones, and feathers to denote status or decorate themselves. This may have played a part in forming an early culture or perhaps even religion, if such jewelry was worn on specific occasions. Some groups of Neanderthals are known to have produced art and music. Cave scratchings from sites in Gibraltar are known, where Neanderthals have created patterns or imagery by carving their scrapers or knives into the rocks of caves. Bone flutes have been uncovered from certain Neanderthal archaeological sites, made from the victims of successful hunts. These flutes may have been used to communicate on hunts, mimic the sounds of animals, scare certain creatures away, or simply because Neanderthals enjoyed the sounds they made. At an extreme level, some Neanderthal communities are thought to have formed what appear to be early cults or religions surrounding particular aspects of wildlife. At some funeral sites, animal remains have been arranged in a decorative fashion, which may note that the Neanderthals at these sites had some form of connection between the creatures involved and the individual that is passed on. The golden eagle, an iconic and famous species of bird of prey, has been included in such rituals. The majestic nature and the power that the creature exudes, combined with the consistency of the use of this species in this manner, may indicate that this was a religious choice. To this day, it is not known if Neanderthals were able to communicate in a fully fledged language, but we do know that they were very vocally adept. Individuals are known to have made a wide range of whoops, shouts, bellows, screams, mutters, and chatters, indicating that, while they may not have been able to speak in the same way you or I can, they were definitely more vocally advanced than the hominids and other apes that preceded them. A basic vocal language of proto-words and phrases may have been used to communicate, but Neanderthals would have been extremely expressive beings and used a wide range of sounds and expressions to denote emotion. The mammoth steppe was a harsh environment, and as the Neanderthals evolved, so did the rest of the wildlife in the region. This time and place in paleontology is synonymous with megafauna, massive mammals and other creatures that evolved to cope with the changing climates. America, for example, is known for its mastodons, big cats, terror birds, and ground sloths. Australia had its giant marsupials, and Africa is still known for its megafauna today. Elephants, giraffes, rhinos, and hippos all qualify. The mammoth steppe of Eurasia, however, had the most iconic megafauna of all. Walking alongside our Neanderthal cousins, as well as early Homo sapiens, would have been, as the mammoth steppe's name suggests, mammoths. Gigantic elephant species, with woolly coats and long, curved tusks, migrated across the Eurasian steppes in huge numbers, usually led by a female matriarch. Well adapted for dealing with the cold and consuming the tough grasses of the steppe, the mammoths thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, and the last remaining population persisted on Wrangel Island in northeastern Russia until around 10,000 years ago. These gigantic proboscideans would have been a challenging but rewarding hunt for early groups of Neanderthals out on the steppe. Alongside the mammoths lived many other species of megafaunal mammal. The woolly rhinoceros was prominent, a species of large, bulky rhinoceros with a woolly coat and large horn. In Siberia, Elasmotherium would have persisted against the cold climates. This rhino-esque creature was once thought to have one single colossal horn, leading to the moniker the Siberian unicorn. But recent studies show it had a flatter, stouter horn, much like a modern Indian rhinoceros. The mighty straight-tusked elephant would have lived in scattered groups on the Great Mammoth Steppe, another challenging hunt for our Neanderthals. The aurochs, a species of large, extinct cattle that only went extinct in 1627, would have thrived in huge numbers too. Perhaps the most spectacular animal of the Mammoth Steppe was Megaloceros, the largest species of deer ever to live. Measuring roughly 3 meters tall, with an antler span of nearly 4 meters, this gigantic cervid would have roamed the steppe in small groups, perhaps coming together in the rutting season. This is a species that also would have been targeted as food by early humans. The Mammoth Steppe was not without its dangers, however, and humans were still very much on the menu for some of the region's carnivorous residents. The Eurasian cave lion was perhaps the biggest threat to Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, which would have violently fought back against the Neanderthals encroaching on its cave space. Cave hyenas populated the steppe also, a larger, more heavily built relative of the African spotted hyena. Cave bears too, although primarily herbivorous, would have aggressively fought off invading humans were they to get too close to the warm caves in which they lived. Various modern species of predator lived on the steppe also. Wolves, wolverines, lynxes, and brown bears also may have posed a threat to the Neanderthals and their modern human cousins. It wasn't all megafauna and danger for the Neanderthals though. As they crossed the steppe, they would have encountered vast herds of wild horses, reindeer, bison, saiga antelope, snow sheep, and muskox. Smaller mammals, such as squirrels, marmots, and pikas, would have formed colonies in the trees, on the rocks, and underground, and a wide variety of bird species would have flown overhead. Vultures and eagles soared high above. Ravens and other passerines populated the trees, while bustards, ptarmigans, and waterfowl wandered the land. It was a diverse and expansive landscape, as full of wonder as it was danger for our ancestors and their Neanderthal cousins. The Neanderthal DNA may exist within us today, but ultimately the Neanderthal does not. Why? What could have caused such a theoretically well-adapted creature to disappear from the face of the earth forever? There are, in fact, numerous theories, each and any of which could be true, or perhaps a combination of several factors. As the Pleistocene progressed, the Neanderthal population sizes became more sparse, and overall number of Neanderthals started to decrease. Eventually, there were very few left, and before long, there were none at all. This could have been the result of interbreeding with human beings. One theory is that their population gradually assimilated itself into ours towards the end of the Pleistocene. The Homo sapiens in these men and women outlasted the Homo neanderthalensis due to the larger population size, and the Neanderthals eventually disappeared as a result, as the theory goes. Another possible cause is climate change. As the mammoth steppe began to recede, the climate began to warm up, and the megafauna began to disappear from the face of the earth. The Neanderthals' environment and food sources began to dwindle. In a world more suited to more advanced Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals may not have been able to compete and died out as a result. Finally, disease is theorized to have been the answer. Maybe an epidemic swept its way through the Neanderthal population, a disease that Homo sapiens outlasted or was immune to. As the disease swept through the steppe, Neanderthals could have passed away in huge numbers, promptly putting an end to the species. Whatever the reason is, Neanderthals disappeared from the face of our world around 40,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens began to become the most prominent species in Eurasia, ultimately spreading out across the entire globe. It's strange to think about the variation in species within our very own genus, Homo. Sure, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo erectus are all very different to us. But we often think of ourselves as being very similar. It is very human to think of ourselves above the laws of nature, above the natural processes of evolution. But today, we're going to be discussing a species that will perfectly broadcast evolution's impact on our genus. On one island, in one country, surrounded by ocean, a species related to us was endemic. Isolated on the island of Flores, in what is now part of the Southeast Asian nation of Indonesia, lived a species of human rather drastically different to most of the others. This was Homo floresiensis, the man of Flores, or Flores Man. Isolated on the island, away from other genuses of human, evolution was free to run wild on this species. And as a result, this was the smallest of all human species. Standing at just marginally over 1 meter in height, Homo floresiensis has been lovingly dubbed the real-life hobbit, after the J.R.R. Tolkien book of the same name. This small species of human was quite unlike anything else in the human fossil record, with perhaps the exception of Homo luzonensis, whose evolution tells a similar story on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. And today, we will be dissecting what we know about Homo floresiensis. We will be traveling back in time to the Indonesian island of Flores to discover what this strange being looked like, how it lived, how it evolved, and ultimately how it became extinct. It is a case quite unlike any other, as we witness firsthand the process of evolution in action, and how it affected some of our early cousins. Join us as we take a journey through the life of Homo floresiensis, or the real-life hobbit. We're closer to Homo floresiensis than you might think. While it might sound like such a primitive-sounding human species would be lost to the annals of the Middle Pleistocene, it actually only went extinct around 50,000 years ago, having appeared on the scene around 190,000 years ago. It is a relatively short time for such a species to be around on planet Earth. Almost a quarter of the time, the Neanderthals roamed the icy northern regions throughout the infamous Ice Age. While we might be close to the species on a geological timescale, we still have much to learn about the actual physiology and structure of these small hominins. Science has known about Homo floresiensis since September of 2003, when a team of joint Australian-Indonesian archaeologists took to Flores' Liang Bua cave with a view of researching the origins of human migration from Asia into Australia, assuming that the Indonesian islands were used as stepping stones along the way. While the research was underway, one of the archaeologists in the team made a remarkable find: the bones of a human species which must have been just over a meter tall at best. The specimen was named LB1 after the cave it was found in, and multiple further skeletons were subsequently dug up throughout the next 12 months. Around 15 incomplete skeletons in total are known to science altogether, one of which was found with a partially preserved skull, giving us a good indication of Homo floresiensis's facial structure. The owner of the skull has since been dubbed the Little Lady of Flores, and was estimated to be around 30 years of age when she died. Other fossil remains attributed to the species include teeth, arm and leg bones, feet, fingers, hips, and shoulders. The fossils were identified, described, and named by anthropologist Peter Brown in 2004, named Homo floresiensis after the island the primates called home. The first thing that was noted about the species goes without saying: it was its diminutive size. Not only was Homo floresiensis physically small, it also had less cranial capacity when compared with Homo sapiens. That's not to say it was less intelligent. We'll go into it in more detail later. But advanced tool use and creation of fire has been associated with the species, indicating that it was a smart species indeed. You would have been able to tell our two species apart by looking at the facial regions alone, in fact. Homo floresiensis's teeth were comparatively larger than our teeth. They lacked a protruding chin, like the ones possessed by us, and their noses were broader and flatter than ours. The little hominins of Flores were also more robust than we were. Their leg bones were comparatively thicker, and their feet were long and flat, with short toes. As a result, Homo floresiensis individuals would have bent their knees further back than we do when walking, forcing them to have low locomotion speeds and an unusual gait, which would have seen them stepping high as opposed to traveling with their feet low to the ground. Their arm bones were also oriented differently to ours. Homo floresiensis's elbow joints were not as flexible as ours, and this forced them into an almost constant shrugging position, with limited movement of the arm joints. The wrists of these hominins were also more akin to those of early Australopithecine hominids, the ones that first stepped down from the trees on two legs in the Middle Pleistocene. That's not to say that their bodies were less advanced than other human species. They had evolved to suit a specific role on their new island home, and each adaptation would have been a result of evolution to suit that new home. A remarkable discovery indeed, but one that doesn't come without its own problems. At the time it was discovered, Homo floresiensis was unlike any other human species known to science. While the species was named as distinct from Homo sapiens in 2004, multiple theories soon arose that this was a mistake, and that these little people of Flores were in fact members of the species Homo sapiens, who suffered physical deformities as a result of birth defects. These theories have in turn been argued against, but we will explore them in this section. The first condition to be proposed from Homo floresiensis skulls was microcephaly, a rare condition when, at birth, a baby's head is smaller than expected. This is usually a result of the baby's head failing to develop during the pregnancy, but it can occur after birth if the infant's head stops growing once it's born. This can also lead to mental development issues going forward in the child's life. This was the theory of American neurologist Jochen Weber, who compared the skull of LB1 with that of a human suffering from microcephaly, concluding that the Homo floresiensis specimen fell within the average size range of Homo sapiens with the condition. It's been a battle back and forth since then, with scientists arguing for and against Weber's theory. The majority of the scientific community do consider Homo floresiensis a separate species, however, and that the skulls are normal-sized for the species, with no signs of impairment. It was also argued in 2007, in a study of the Homo floresiensis bones, that the specimen may have been Homo sapiens suffering from Laron syndrome, a condition that may stem from interbreeding, when a human is unable to make use of growth hormones, often causing a shorter stature and a smaller skull. This too is dubious, as no DNA samples have been taken to prove or disprove it. Also suggested, and all but disproved, were congenital iodine deficiency syndrome and Down syndrome, which are both known to cause impairments in physical and mental growth throughout an individual's life. In all cases, subsequent studies have shown that the Homo floresiensis bones in question do not show enough symptoms or characteristics of these conditions for the theories to be accurate. So, we know what Homo floresiensis looked like and where it was found. But how did it evolve? How did a species descended from hominins almost the size of modern humans get so small in comparison? The answer can be found in its environment. Islands. Island dwarfism, or insular dwarfism, is the evolutionary process which took hold in order to produce Homo floresiensis. But how does it work? Our little hominin cousins are actually a prime example. When Homo floresiensis's descendants first arrived in Flores, they were inadvertently trapped there. It is not known for certain exactly how their descendants arrived in Flores. Perhaps they floated over on debris, carried by the ocean winds from mainland Asia. Perhaps they even swam, island hopping in bamboo rafts across various parts of Malaysia and Indonesia as they went. Alternatively, it could be that a temporary land bridge sprung up, connecting Flores to the area Homo floresiensis's descendants were living, only to disappear and trap a population there over time. Over the millennia, the descendants of Homo floresiensis began to change in correspondence to their new environment. On the mainland, a hominid could travel wherever he or she wanted. With no natural barriers, food was in abundance, and the world was theirs to explore. On an island surrounded by the ocean, however, these people became trapped. They could not, for one reason or another, manage to leave the island safely. An island is only so big, and food resources, if you cannot leave it, are limited. Natural selection therefore intervenes, and for those species that manage it, small sizes evolve. Being smaller generally means you don't require as much food to fuel your body, and in turn, that makes you better adapted to dealing with a limited environment. Plenty of modern examples of island dwarfism can be seen across the world. The island of Nosy Hara, off the coast of Madagascar, is full of creatures who are much smaller than their mainland Madagascan counterparts, due to island dwarfism. Examples include the Nosy Hara dwarf lemur and the Nosy Hara dwarf chameleon, both of which are but a mere fraction of their usual sizes when found elsewhere. It even happened to the dinosaurs. Europasaurus, a genus of long-necked sauropod dinosaur related to the famous Brachiosaurus, became stranded on islands, which are now parts of Lower Saxony in Germany. As a result, these creatures measured 6 meters long, relatively minute when you take into account that their mainland cousins were pushing 23 meters. Conversely, island gigantism can also take place. Essentially, this is the reverse of what happened to Homo floresiensis. Instead of having large animals shrink, small animals grow large. Often, if there is an abundance of food available to them on that island that is not being exploited by a species which is already part of that ecosystem. Modern examples include Galapagos giant tortoises, the Philippine eagle, and the New Caledonian giant gecko. Whereas on the extinct roster, we have giant moas, sloth lemurs, and dodos. Similar to other species of hominin that had spread themselves across the planet by the end of the Pleistocene, Homo floresiensis was no stranger to tools and technology. They were not of the standard of some of the later members of the Homo genus, such as Sapiens and Neanderthalensis. But they did the job that the diminutive island men required them to do: help them feed. Some of the tools harnessed by the early people of Flores include stone flakes and blades, perforation tools, and points. These tools date back to around 102,000 years ago, and were likely used to slice and stab at small to medium-sized mammals that were hunted by Homo floresiensis. Furthermore, research that has been carried out on the polish and residue on some of the stone tools from Flores indicate that these people were using some of the blades and cutting devices to shape wood, which may have pointed to them being able to use spears or traps. These would have been basic, there's no doubt about that, but they would have been able to effectively wound the animals Homo floresiensis preferred to hunt, for the troop to close in with their spears and blades. We also have concrete evidence that Homo floresiensis was able to use and control fire. Animal bones from the region indicate signs of burning, which seems as though they were cooked, or at least held over a fire to make the meat more palatable. Like other early humans, it is within reason that Homo floresiensis perhaps knew how to at least transport fire, or to make the most of it when hunting in the field. It wasn't just meat that these diminutive hominins were feeding on in the jungles of Flores, however. Evidence points to these early people cooking both meat and plant matter. And wear on the teeth of the collected specimens could be there as a result of the individuals chewing tough, fibrous plant matter. It is also sensible to speculate that as they traversed their island homes, they would have picked up a range of fruits to complement their potentially diverse diets. Still, despite the fact that this species came to be relatively late on in the Pleistocene, there is little reason to believe that they had harnessed a complex language. Lack of evidence points to these island dwellers having developed their vocal tracts to the point where they could hold a decent conversation. Instead, it is possible that they made a series of word-like sounds, including grunts, whoops, shouts, screams, and chitters. Today, Flores is one of the lesser Sunda Islands, located in southern Indonesia. In the grand scheme of things, it isn't huge. It's about 15,000 square kilometers in area. A very thin, snaking landmass. Being an island, the habitats vary. Volcanoes and mountains jut out from the center of the island, surrounded by tropical forests which reach the beaches. Amidst these forests were clearings and caves, many of which would have been utilized by Homo floresiensis as it wandered about its daily business. Sandy beaches, warm seas, and coral reefs surround the island, and the island is positively blooming with flowers and greenery. It sounds like a lush paradise, a perfect spot for an early hominin to find itself stranded for several 100,000 years. And at first sight, it probably was. Homo floresiensis were not alone on Flores. And due to the effects of island gigantism, they were not the top predators. Our little cousins lived in the shadows of a deadly reptilian hunter that would have no doubt made a meal out of them, given the chance. The infamous Komodo dragon. As the largest lizard in the world, this apex predator can reach around 3 meters in length in extreme circumstances, and can easily pose a threat to even the most prepared members of our own species. It still lives on the island surrounding Flores to this day, where it utilizes a rather grisly method of hunting, combining their sharp teeth with a venomous bite. All it takes for these huge monitor lizards to kill their prey is one snap. Hunting parties of dragons will, in modern times, bite large hooved animals, and then simply wait for the venom and bleeding to take effect, patiently standing by while the victim suffers a grisly, untimely death. Conflict between Homo floresiensis and the Komodo dragons is certain to have taken place in the jungles and clearings of Flores, and unless the little hominins were lucky, it may not have ended well for them often. Fortunately, the primates would have been able to climb in dire circumstances, out of the reach of the venom, teeth, and 70 kilograms worth of muscle. Another, less likely carnivore was also present on Flores at the time of the Flores Man. Sadly, it is now extinct, lost to the void of natural history. But in life, it was surely spectacular. Leptoptilus robustus was its name, a stork under the spell of island gigantism, the size of an adult Homo sapien. At nearly 2 meters tall, remains of the stork have been unearthed in the Liang Bua cave, alongside specimens of Homo floresiensis. Whether or not one species hunted the other, they were certainly close neighbors. As a member of the Leptoptilus genus, this stork has 3 extant relatives: Africa's marabou stork, and Asia's lesser and greater adjutants. Scientists have been able to infer that, due to the close proximity to these living birds in the stork family tree, that the giant stork of Flores likely looked very similar, only bigger, and probably meaner too. Although its modern cousins are mainly carrion feeders, they are known to take live prey. Fish, insects, amphibians, baby crocodiles, and even flamingos are readily taken by these odd-looking avians. A handful of scientists have theorized that the giant Flores stork may have been capable of taking Homo floresiensis individuals, potentially young or sick members of the troop. If so, it was a dangerous world for these pint-sized primates. Island gigantism also extended to some of the much more unlikely residents of Flores: rats. Much larger than the brown or black rats that can be found in the northern hemisphere, these rodents, over half a meter in length, still exist on the island today. It's not just giant rats that would have shared the forests with Homo floresiensis, however. A colorful array of birds, reptiles, amphibians, and insects would have fluttered, leapt, and buzzed through the undergrowth, some of which were likely picked off by the hominins as easy meals. Today, the island is still very much a naturalist's wonderland, rife with the luminous plumages of flowerpeckers, hanging parrots, sunbirds, pittas, and hornbills. Perhaps the strangest creature to share the forest with Homo floresiensis was what our little cousins actually ended up hunting: several species of the genus Stegodon, an animal very closely related to elephants, that in other parts of the world were growing to some of the largest mammals of their time. However, this is a tropical island, and nothing is what it seems when it comes to evolution and prehistory. The Stegodon species on Flores were comparative dwarves to their continental species. In fact, they would have probably only grown up to your shoulder, and that's an upper estimate. Some of these species were more akin to the sizes of donkeys and goats than elephants, in yet another strikingly bizarre occurrence of island evolution. It was in fact Stegodon bones that were found in Liang Bua cave, with evidence of burn marks, implying that these little proboscideans were being hunted, butchered, cooked, and eaten by the dwarf hominins of Flores. This was a world where dragons and giant birds ate people, who in turn ate elephants. As you have most likely realized, there are no other species of human being alive on planet Earth today. Homo sapien is the only one to remain, and Homo floresiensis is unfortunately a thing of the past. But why? Surely, secluded on their little island paradise, these primates could have thrived, away from the turmoil and chaos of the mainland. As with all things in nature, it isn't that simple. Two main theories are running as to why Homo floresiensis disappeared from the jungles of Indonesia. And as it usually happens, Homo sapiens interference is listed as one of them. Theories have been considered which note the fact that Homo floresiensis disappeared, just as Homo sapiens arrived in Flores. Perhaps when the two species met, the island dwellers did not welcome the intrusion. Alternatively, perhaps the early humans didn't recognize Homo floresiensis as humans, wiping them out so they could live on Flores. Of course, it needn't have been violent at all. It might have just been a case of tough competition. As sapiens moved in, perhaps floresiensis just couldn't keep up. Humans, as we know, are destructive, and being larger, required more food than the original inhabitants of Flores. As the humans hunted the stegodon, relied upon by the island dwellers, maybe they couldn't cope with the loss of food and died out as a result. Alternatively, there is a chance that the little hominins were victim of their own environment. Flores is a volcanic island, with one main active volcano, Kelimutu. Evidence of volcanic eruptions show that the mountain could have choked the island in the Pleistocene, wiping out the large inhabitants of Flores, either directly or indirectly through wiping out food sources. Either way, the little people of Flores are lost to time, and all we have is their bones. The world over, a myriad of myths abound regarding stories of wild men or ape men who secretly hide themselves in the forested regions of the world. Often prehistoric species are blamed or attributed to these stories, often with little concrete evidence. But the stories are interesting to say the least. Homo floresiensis is no different. However, as you can imagine though, they aren't going to be the subject of a Bigfoot-like story, nor are they the explanation for the Yeti of the Himalayas. No, Homo floresiensis has been looped into Indonesian folklore, in the myth of the Ebu Gogo. The people of Flores have long spoken of little human-like creatures that scamper around the island's jungles. They have named these creatures the Ebu Gogo, Ebu translating to grandparent, and Gogo translating to one who eats anything in the native Nake language of the central region of Flores. Stories originating from the island, presumably passed down over generations, describe the Ebu Gogo as quick-moving humanoids, just over a meter in height. Their faces and noses are broad and flat. Their bodies are hairy, and they are allegedly capable of producing whisper-like chattering noises, repeating what is said to them in parrot fashion. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? One of the most well-known stories concerning the Ebu Gogo describes how villagers in the 18th century grew tired of the creatures stealing from their settlements and attacking their children. When they could take no more, it was time to hatch a plan. In a Southeast Asian spin on the story of the Trojan horse, The villagers showered the Ebu Gogo with gifts in order to convince them to stop the raids, specifically palm fiber, which could help the little humanoids craft clothes. Only there was a sinister catch. As soon as the Ebu Gogo carried the palm fiber off into the cave, the villagers tossed in a firebrand after them, igniting the easily flammable gifts and the creatures carrying them. The story goes that almost all of the Ebu Gogo were killed in the retaliative attack, but one pair managed to escape the blaze, and the Ebu Gogo are rumored to reside deep within the forests of Flores to this day. It's an elaborate and entertaining tale, but how much of it is true? The stories of the Ebu Gogo predate the discovery of Homo floresiensis, for starters. These tales supposedly span generations, whereas science has only known about the existence of Homo floresiensis for 20 years. So it was then that when ethnologist Gregory IV suggested in 2008 that there may be a hint of truth in the Ebu Gogo legends, and that the stories actually describe ancient encounters between our own species and Homo floresiensis, the cryptozoology community went wild. A quick search of the species will lead you to its connections to folklore before too long. But could that really be true? Were there truly surviving populations of this small hominin roaming around the forests of Flores in the 18th century, stealing food and human children from villages? Most scientists don't seem to think so. The lack of bones younger than 50,000 years old is what sways it. There's just simply no way that such a notable species could go unnoticed on a densely populated island for so many years without scientific record or detection. For now, it looks as though the Ebu Gogo will remain a myth, until we've got scientific proof of an extinct hominin from the late Pleistocene creeping through the jungles of Flores. Homo floresiensis can also consider itself a pop culture reference. Hobbit is actually the most common nickname for these hominins, based on the fictional race of short humanoids in the book by the same name. When the bones were dug up, some of its discoverers actually suggested calling the creature Homo habilis,